The rain drizzled gently on the windshield of Officer James Carter's patrol car as he cruised down the empty highway, his mind wandering to memories that never quite faded. His daughter, Emily, had been gone for 3 years, a car accident that shattered his world in ways he couldn't even begin to piece together. Despite the passage of time, her laughter still echoed in his mind, a haunting reminder of a life abruptly stolen. James had taken the night shift again, partly to keep his mind occupied and partly to avoid the emptiness of his house. The hum of the radio crackled with static, the dispatcher's voice breaking the silence intermittently with routine updates. James hardly paid attention. The quiet stretches of the road gave him too much time to think. But that was the nature of the job: long hours, endless roads, and too many memories clawing their way back. As he rounded a curve, his headlights caught the faint glimmer of a vehicle ahead, moving slower than it should. Instinctively, he flipped on his patrol lights and closed the distance. It was a beat-up sedan, its taillight flickering with a faint, irregular glow. James tapped his steering wheel, debating whether to pull the car over. Maybe the driver wasn't paying attention, or perhaps it was a case of a faulty light. Either way, it was his duty to check. Pulling behind the car, he reached for the radio. "Dispatch, this is Officer Carter. Running a plate check on a gray sedan, license 7K2. He paused as the vehicle suddenly swerved slightly, correcting itself almost immediately. James narrowed his eyes, alert. Was the driver impaired? It didn't seem like they'd noticed his lights yet. He flicked on his siren briefly, a sharp chirp to grab their attention. The car veered to the shoulder, coming to a hesitant stop. James turned off the siren, but left the lights flashing, illuminating the dark roadside in bursts of red and blue. He grabbed his flashlight and adjusted his belt before stepping out, the cool night air biting through his uniform. Approaching the car cautiously, James took in the details. The windows were tinted, and the interior was dark. His fingers tightened around the flashlight as he tapped on the driver's side window. "Evening. This is Officer Carter with the Highway Patrol. Can you roll down the window, please?" The driver complied slowly, the window lowering with a mechanical whine. A middle-aged man with disheveled hair had a nervous expression sat behind the wheel. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles pale. "Good evening, officer," the man said, his voice strained. "License and registration, please," James said, keeping his tone professional but firm. The man fumbled with the glove compartment, his movements jerky and hesitant. Something about his demeanor set James on edge, a flicker of fear in his eyes as though he were hiding something. James shifted his flashlight slightly, the beam catching a glimpse of the back seat. For a second, his breath caught. He stepped back, his heart hammering. In the dim light, he saw her, Emily, or at least someone who looked exactly like her. The same golden hair that always caught the sunlight just right, the same delicate features he had memorized from countless photographs, and the same soft expression that had been lost to him 3 years ago. "Emily?" He whispered, the word barely audible. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be her. And yet the resemblance was undeniable. The driver seemed to notice James' reaction and tensed visibly. "Is something wrong, officer?" he asked, his voice taking on an edge of panic. James ignored the question, his mind racing. He stepped closer, his flashlight trembling slightly as he directed it toward the back seat again. The girl's head turned toward him, her eyes meeting his. There was recognition in them, familiar and piercing. "Step out of the vehicle," James said sharply, his voice breaking the eerie silence. The driver hesitated, his eyes darting toward the ignition. James' hand moved instinctively toward his holster. "Now," he barked. The man finally complied, opening the door and stepping out slowly, his hands raised. James kept his flashlight trained on the back seat, unwilling to look away from the girl who couldn't be there. "Who is she?" James demanded, his voice cracking under the weight of emotion. The driver hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the girl and back to James. "She's my niece," he stammered. But there was something in his tone, a tremor that betrayed the lie. James' grip tightened on his flashlight. He had to know the truth. He had to know who this girl was and why she looked so much like his daughter. But before he could press further, the girl in the back seat leaned forward, her voice soft and chillingly familiar. "Daddy," she said. The word hit him like a thunderclap, leaving him frozen in place, his mind spinning with questions he couldn't begin to answer. Who was this girl? And how could she possibly know him? James stood frozen in disbelief, his heart pounding in his chest. The girl's voice, a single word, shattered every ounce of composure he had left. It wasn't just that she looked like Emily. It was the way she said "daddy," soft yet full of certainty, as if she had spoken the word 1,000 times before. The air around him seemed to thicken, the faint sound of the rain fading into a dull hum. "Who is she?" James repeated, his voice now trembling with a mixture of fear and hope. He glanced at the man standing by the car, whose hands were still raised. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, his eyes darted toward the girl in the back seat, then back to James. "Look, officer, I can explain," the man began, his tone uneven. "Explain now," James snapped, cutting him off. He stepped closer to the man, his flashlight trained on the driver's face. "Who is she, and why did she call me that?" The man's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. "She's my niece," he said again, but this time the words felt forced, almost rehearsed. She gets confused sometimes, says things she doesn't mean." James didn't buy it for a second. The girl's voice still echoed in his mind. It wasn't confusion, it was conviction. He turned his attention back to her. She was sitting perfectly still, her wide eyes locked on his. In those eyes, he saw something painfully familiar, an innocence he thought he'd never see again. "What's your name?" James asked her gently, his tone softening. He took a small step closer to the car, trying to keep his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. The girl hesitated, glancing at the man outside the car. For a moment, it seemed like she might not answer. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Emily." James felt the ground shift beneath him. It couldn't be her. He knew that. He buried her. He'd stood at her grave, stared at the cold, hard reality of her loss. And yet every part of him screamed that this girl, this impossibility, was his daughter. "That's not possible," James said, his voice cracking. He turned to the man again, his frustration boiling over. "You better start telling me the truth, and you better do it now." The man raised his hands higher, his face pale. "I'm telling you, officer, she's my niece. I don't know why she's saying that. Maybe she's scared or confused." James stepped closer, his flashlight beam bouncing between the man and the girl. "You expect me to believe that? She looks exactly like my daughter, and she just called me her dad." The tension hung heavy in the air, and James could feel his grip on reality slipping. His mind raced, trying to piece together a logical explanation. Was it a coincidence? Could this girl just be some random stranger with an uncanny resemblance to Emily? Or was there something else, something darker, at play? The man opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the girl spoke again. "You don't remember me?" she asked, her voice tinged with hurt. "It's me, Daddy. It's Emily." James's heart clenched. He felt as though he were being torn apart, caught between the undeniable truth of what he knew and the impossible reality unfolding in front of him. Every instinct told him to believe her, but his rational mind screamed that it couldn't be true. "Emily," he said softly, his voice barely audible. He took another step toward the car, lowering the flashlight so it wouldn't shine in her face. How do you know me?" The girl tilted her head slightly, as if confused by the question. "You're my dad," she said simply. Her gaze was steady, unflinching. The man by the car shifted uncomfortably. "Look, officer," he said, his tone desperate. "I swear I'm not doing anything wrong. I didn't kidnap her or anything. She's my niece, and I'm just trying to get her home." James turned on him sharply. "Where is home?" he demanded. "And if she's your niece, why does she think I'm her father?" The man hesitated, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled for an answer. "It's complicated," he said finally. "Uncomplicated," James snapped. He was done playing games. His patience, already worn thin, was now non-existent. The man has "Emily," James said again, turning back to the girl. "If you're really my daughter, tell me something only she would know." The girl's expression softened, and for a moment, James thought he saw a flicker of recognition in her eyes. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, the man lunged forward, grabbing James's arm. "That's enough," the man shouted, his voice panicked. "She's just a kid. Leave her alone." James reacted instinctively, pulling free from the man's grip and shoving him back. "Get back," he ordered, his hand moving to his holster. The man stumbled but didn't back down. "You're scaring her," he said, his voice rising. "Just let us go. We didn't do anything wrong." James didn't budge. His focus was on the girl, who was now watching the scene unfold with wide, fearful eyes. He knew he couldn't let them leave, not until he had answers. "Nobody's going anywhere," James said firmly. "Not until I figure out what's going on here." The man's shoulders sagged, and for a moment he looked utterly defeated. Then, without warning, he bolted for the driver's side door. "Stop," James shouted, drawing his weapon. The man froze, his hands hovering in the air. James could see the fear etched on his face, but he didn't lower his gun. He couldn't take any chances, not with the girl's life, and not with the possibility that she might actually be his daughter. "Step away from the car," James ordered, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. The man hesitated but eventually complied, stepping back with his hands raised. James kept his weapon trained on him as he reached for his radio. "Dispatch," he said, his voice calm but urgent. "I need backup at my location. Possible abduction case. Send units immediately." As he spoke, his eyes flicked back to the girl in the car. She was still watching him, her expression a mix of fear and confusion. And in that moment, James knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The stillness of the road was shattered by the distant sound of sirens. James could hear his backup on the way, but each second felt like an eternity. The man stood motionless a few feet from the car, his hands still raised. His eyes darted nervously between James and the girl in the back seat, as though weighing his next move. James kept his weapon trained on the man, his mind a storm of conflicting emotions. He couldn't shake the way the girl had looked at him, the way she'd said his name. It wasn't just a face that reminded him of Emily. It was her presence, the essence of who she was. But it wasn't possible. He'd seen Emily's lifeless body, held her hand as he said goodbye. There was no coming back from that. "Why are you so nervous?" James asked the man, his voice tight. "If you've got nothing to hide, why act like this?" The man shook his head, his expression desperate. "I told you, officer, she's my niece. I didn't do anything wrong. I didn't think it would go this far." "What wouldn't go this far?" James pressed. "Start talking." The man hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the flashing lights of James' patrol car. "I'm not her dad, okay? But I swear she's safe with me. I wasn't trying to hurt her or take her from anyone." James' jaw tightened. "You're not making any sense. If you're not her father, then who is? And why does she look exactly like my daughter?" "I don't know," the man burst out, his voice cracking. I was told to keep her safe. That's all I know." "Told by who?" James demanded, taking a step closer. The man clammed up, his lips pressing into a thin line. It was clear he was withholding something, and James wasn't about to let him off the hook. But before he could push further, the girl in the back seat shifted, her small voice cutting through the tension. "Daddy, please don't hurt him," she said, her eyes wide and pleading. James felt his resolve falter. Her words hit him like a gut punch, pulling at every raw nerve he tried to bury over the years. He turned his gaze toward her, his heart aching with an intensity he couldn't explain. "I'm not going to hurt anyone," he said gently, lowering his weapon slightly. "I just need to understand what's going on." The girl stared at him for a long moment, then glanced at the man. "Uncle Matt, you promised he'd be okay." James' ears perked up at the name. Matt. Finally, a piece of the puzzle. "Matt, huh?" James said, turning his attention back to the man. "Why don't we start there? Who are you, and how do you know her?" Matt let out a shaky breath, his shoulders slumping. "My name's Matt Harper. I work for a private organization. They placed her in my care a few months ago. Told me she needed protection." James' brows furrowed. Protection from what? Matt hesitated again, his eyes darting toward the ground. "From people who would use her. I don't know all the details, but she's special, okay? She's not like other kids." James felt a chill run down his spine. The way Matt spoke, the secrecy surrounding this girl, it all felt like the beginning of a bad dream. But the pieces still didn't add up. "Special how?" James asked, his voice low. Matt shook his head. "I can't say. I don't even know everything myself. They just told me to keep her safe, to stay under the radar. But I guess that didn't work out too well, huh?" James clenched his jaw, frustration bubbling to the surface. He was tired of half answers and cryptic explanations. But before he could press further, the sirens grew louder, and moments later, 2 squad cars pulled up behind his. The officers who stepped out were familiar faces, Cole and Martinez, both seasoned and steady under pressure. Cole approached first, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. "Carter, what's going on?" he asked, his sharp eyes taking in the scene. James gave a quick rundown, keeping his voice calm but firm. "Possible abduction case. The man's name is Matt Harper. Claims the girl is his niece, but she's saying things that don't add up." Cole nodded, his expression hardening. "We'll take it from here." James wasn't ready to let go just yet. "I need to stay on this, Cole. There's something about her. Something I need to figure out. Cole glanced at him, his brow furrowing. You okay, Carter? You look like you've seen a ghost. James didn't answer. How could he explain what he was feeling without sounding insane? Instead, he turned back to Matt, his gaze sharp. You're coming with us, he said, and we're going to sort this out. Matt didn't resist as Martinez cuffed him and led him toward one of the squad cars. James watched as they loaded him in, his mind racing with questions. But his attention was soon drawn back to the girl, who remained in the back seat of the sedan, her small frame illuminated by the patrol lights. As Cole moved to open the car door, James stepped in front of him. I'll talk to her, he said firmly. Cole hesitated but eventually nodded, stepping back. James crouched slightly to meet the girl's gaze through the open window. Emily, he said softly, the name still feeling foreign on his tongue. Can you come with me? I just want to make sure you're safe. She hesitated, her wide eyes searching his face. Then slowly she nodded. James opened the door carefully and extended a hand. She took it without hesitation, her small fingers gripping his tightly. The sensation was painfully familiar, and for a moment, James felt like he was holding Emily's hand again, his Emily. As he led her toward his patrol car, she looked up at him, her voice quiet but steady. You believe me, don't you? James glanced down at her, his heart aching. I don't know what to believe right now, but I'll find out. I promise. Her expression softened, and she gave a small nod, but the moment was short-lived. As they reached the patrol car, James noticed something out of the corner of his eye. A dark SUV parked just down the road, its headlights off but its engine running. His instincts kicked in immediately. He turned to Cole. We've got company. Cole followed his gaze, his hand moving to his weapon. Stay here, he said to James, signaling to Martinez to back him up. But as the two officers approached the SUV, the vehicle suddenly roared to life and sped off into the darkness. James felt his grip tighten on the girl's hand as he watched the taillights disappear. Whoever they were, they didn't want to be seen. And that only raised more questions. Questions James wasn't sure he was ready to face. James couldn't shake the feeling that something much larger was at play. The dark SUV speeding away had only deepened the mystery. Who were they? Why had they been lurking nearby, watching? And most importantly, what did they want with Emily? He glanced down at the little girl standing beside him. She was so calm, unnervingly so, as if none of this chaos fazed her. Her hand in his was warm and steady, and for a fleeting moment, he wondered if she understood far more than she let on. Cole and Martinez returned, shaking their heads. No plates, Cole said, his voice tight. SUV was gone before we could even get close. Whoever they were, they didn't want to stick around. James nodded grimly. They were watching us, waiting for the right moment. Cole narrowed his eyes. What are you thinking, Carter? You think this ties back to the girl? James didn't answer right away. Instead, he knelt to Emily's level, searching her face. Emily, he said gently, do you know who those people were? The ones in the SUV. She shook her head, but there was hesitation in her movement, a flicker of something she wasn't saying. No, she whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. James wasn't convinced. Before he could press her further, the radio crackled to life on his shoulder, dispatch alerting them of new developments. All units, be advised, the voice said, calm but urgent. Suspicious activity reported in connection with earlier abduction call. Potential armed suspects, proceed with caution. James exchanged a look with Cole, who swore under his breath. This just keeps getting better, Cole muttered. You sure you're not in over your head with this one? James straightened, his jaw tightening. I need to get her somewhere safe. Cole studied him for a moment before nodding. Take her back to the station. We'll handle things here. But Carter, he added, his tone softening. Be careful. James didn't respond. He scooped Emily up and placed her gently in the back seat of his patrol car. As he started the engine and pulled away, his mind raced with possibilities. Who were these people after her? And what did Matt mean when he called her special? There were too many questions, and not enough answers. The drive to the station felt endless. Emily sat silently in the back, her small hands folded in her lap. James glanced at her through the rearview mirror, trying to gauge her emotions, but her expression was unreadable. Emily, he said after a while, breaking the silence. If there's anything you know, anything at all, you need to tell me. I can't help you if I don't understand what's happening. She didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was so quiet he almost didn't hear her. They don't want me to be found. Who doesn't? James pressed, gripping the wheel tighter. The people who took me, she said, her voice trembling now. They said I was important. that I couldn't go back to my real family. Jane's chest tightened. Why would they say that? What are they on with you? She looked up, her eyes meeting his in the mirror. For the first time, he saw fear in her gaze. Because I know things, she whispered. Things I'm not supposed to. James felt a chill run down his spine. What kind of things, Emily? She shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. I don't know. I remember stuff. Stuff that's not mine. The weight of her words hung heavy in the car. James didn't know what to make of it. Was this some kind of elaborate trick? Or was this little girl really telling the truth? And if she was, what did it all mean? As they neared the station, James' phone buzzed in the console. He picked it up, glancing at the screen. It was an unknown number. Against his better judgment, he answered. Officer Carter, he said, his voice worry. There was a brief pause before a distorted voice came through the line. You have something that doesn't belong to you. Jane's blood ran cold. Who is this? That's not important. The voice said, calm and detached. What matters is that you hand her over. If you don't, things will get very bad for you. And for her. Jane's grip on the phone tightened. If you think I'm going to let you hurt her, you're dead wrong. The voice chuckled darkly. You don't understand what you're dealing with, officer. This isn't about you. It never was. Just do the smart thing and walk away. The line went dead before James could respond. He stared at the phone in his hand, his heart pounding. The call confirmed his worst fears. This wasn't a random abduction. This was something far more sinister. By the time they arrived at the station, James' mind was a storm of conflicting thoughts. He led Emily inside, heaping a protective hand on her shoulder. The station was bustling, officers moving with purpose as reports of suspicious activity poured in. James brought Emily to a quiet room, sitting her down on a worn couch. Stay here, he said gently. I need to make a call, but I'll be right outside, okay? She nodded, clutching a small stuffed bear she'd been holding since they left the scene. James stepped into the hallway, dialing the number for his captain. Carter, the captain said, his tone clipped. What's going on? It's about the girl, James said, keeping his voice low. There's more to this than we thought. Someone just called me, demanding I hand her over. They're watching us. The captain let out a heavy sigh. We'll increase security at the station. But Carter, you need to tread carefully. If this is as big as you're saying, we might be dealing with more than just a kidnapping. I know, James said, his jaw tightening. But I'm not letting them take her. Be smart about this, the captain warned. Don't let it get personal. James ended the call, his mind racing. He knew the captain was right, but it was already too late for that. This wasn't just another case. This was Emily, whether it made sense or not. As he turned to re-enter the room, the lights in the hallway flickered. A low hum filled the air, and for a brief moment, everything felt unnaturally still. James' instincts screamed at him. Something was very wrong.